I've always been told I'm extremely lucky to be a white man. Is it as simple as that?
No, and obviously this kind of identity nonsense, I think, is probably coming to an end. Hopefully, I've been trying to say today in a sort of discussion about the culture wars that actually people are making their own new culture. There is a kind of flourishing and a renaissance of people doing their own thing outside of existing institutions. And I think there is sort of growing resistance to this kind of politics that would, demonize you for things that are in a way beyond your control. And in fact, the gift of God, it's not your fault that you were born a white man. You exist. We all exist. And, we should just try and get along.
This sounds great. I feel fantastic. Thank you for saying this. In writing What Do Men Want?, you spoke to a lot of men about what they would speak about just among themselves. What kinds of things did you learn anything that was like new to you?
Not really. I mean, I think in the end, it's kind of complicated what I tried to do. So basically, I wrote a book that was actually very hopeful and aspirational and about how we do already get along. And that there is a lot of compatibility. And I went down some dark routes to some degree, but I didn't want to go as dark as all that. And I think one of the things that men did say to me was that you have no idea how dark it is to be a man, which is kind of interesting.
Dark in what sense?
I suppose in terms of like male desire in particular.
Yeah. Okay. So they like men... They didn't have to give you specifics as such?
I mean, some people wanted to talk about it. I spoke to some men who sort of had issues with pornography and, sort of various things to do with the kind of compulsive nature of male sexuality, which I think is maybe more of an issue for some men.
Must vary, yeah.
Yeah, than others. But also, I think there are kind of differences between men and women which we can talk about in broad terms. And I think male sexuality is often off limits for women, theoretically or conceptually, because there's a lot about it we don't necessarily want to understand.
Ooh. Okay, so what kinds of things?
Well, I think partly it might just be to do with things like a kind of greater desire for sex on the part of men who are at least, libidinal. There are lots of men I spoke to who are older who say they're very relieved that they no longer have to think about it in the same way, and they're not dominated by desire in the same way that they used to be. So obviously, because the book is called What Do Men Want? And I was sort of mocking Freud, because Freud famously says, what do women want? And he says, I don't know. So obviously I say, I don't know as well. But then I was going through this idea of desire, right? So what is desire? Is desire different for men than for women? So that was one aspect of it, I suppose, the kind of almost demonic nature of male desire in some ways.
I suppose there's then a debate between to what extent men are enthralled to their desires, and there's just these victims of, as Russell Brand might put it, to do with he has a sex addiction. And then other people might say, look, we've all got wants and desires and needs. Can we control them? And so I guess maybe we should fall somewhere in the middle.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not like women don't have problems too, and that, we all have sort of negative tendencies as individuals and as members of, one of the two sexes. So I suppose, one thing I'm trying to say is that we can all be slightly better. We don't have to fall into this trap of blaming the other sex, which is a temptation for both men and for women, right? So let's say you've had a bad relationship with a woman, or a woman's had a bad relationship with a man, the temptation to then generalize and say, well, all men are X, all women are Y, and then this has an effect on how you come to understand the world as such, you know what I mean? And we kind of have to get along with each other, or at least it's better and more interesting if we try to do so, even though it's very difficult because human beings are very strange and awkward.
And tribal.
And tribal, yes. But it's interesting, isn't it? Because obviously the relationship between men and women cuts across tribe in some ways, right? Like, you could say, well, women are one tribe and men are another, but at the same time, we live in this completely mixed world in which we work together, live together, we necessarily confront each other. We don't live in a sex segregated society, particularly not in the modern world. We're kind of around each other all the time. And I think one of the things that's kind of causing a problem that's generating a lot of antagonism is this proximity. You know, the fact that men and women are together almost too much. You know what I mean? And that we don't have sometimes enough time with members of the same sex, you know, women together and men together, which I think a lot of both men and women would like more of, if you see what I mean.
That's really interesting. I think it's such a weird thing, because there's no other minorities, I suppose, where we're biologically, if we talk about our hardware rather than our software, where our hardware is different. At least I don't know how much, I don't want to go into eugenics and things like that, but all the minorities of people, we're the same, we all bleed, we all whatever. But men and women are biologically different, and we don't really talk about that much. Are there key differences between men and women?
Yeah, I mean, very much so. And I think, you know, the modern world sort of creates this illusion or this fantasy that they're not that important, or that we can kind of overcome them in the name of like formal equality, for example, or the fact that we're all economic agents, we're all moral beings. You know, there's many things that we share. But I think, you know, when we go past a certain point and we say, oh, these differences don't matter, or we can pretend that they don't exist, or we can use language in order to sort of deny their reality, or we can change sex, you know, that's when we're in a kind of, you know, very crazy making space, in fact. And I think with the language question, we've seen a lot of attacks on the use of language that is specific to women in particular, like, you know, use of the word mother, female, woman, and so on. And this is like really mind-bending if you're a woman.
I bet.
You know, it's been a very, very strange few years. The idea that like woman is just this floating word that men can take and use, but women themselves are not allowed to talk about being a woman, you know, and it, you know, maybe that's an exaggeration, but I don't think so. There is something about this overly linguistic culture that has removed us from our embodiment in the name of desire. Like, so someone wants to say, a man wants to be seen as a woman, that his desire is more important, let's say, for some reason, than women's desire to have their own language and preserve their own reality and talk about their own existences. You know what I mean? So yeah, there is a kind of war going on.
Yeah, well, that's interesting, because I think that does get lost a lot of the time. With the trans debate, a lot of it tends to be about children, you know, rightly so. Children shouldn't be doing this to themselves. It's a decision you're too young to make. It changes truth and all these things, but we don't talk enough, I don't think, about what it does to women and their autonomy. I blame Judith Butler. And Judith Butler, and for those who don't know, she was a gender theory, that maybe one of the leading figures back in the day. And she was all about, there isn't any difference, if I'm reading her right, I don't know, biologically between men and women, it's only socially constructed. But then in recent years seems to have done a U-turn to align herself with some of the trans ideology.
Well,
no, or not.
No, I mean, yes, sort of. I mean, she's still a gender theorist in the sense that she's talking about gender as performative. So, and that there is no kind of sex that we can refer to as this kind of natural, you know, foundation, if you see what I mean. So everything becomes performative, I guess, is what, you know, one way of understanding Gender Trouble, or the final part of that book. Her ideas have been taken up, but they've been really quite exaggerated. And she hasn't tried to argue against that either. So, I mean, I regard her as a kind of traitor to women, to be honest.
She hasn't argued against what?
the take up of her ideas and the extension of them into trans ideology.
Right.
So she's sort of seemingly happy to go along with that. And she often calls feminists fascists and things like this, which is really unhelpful and inaccurate, you know. And there's nothing fascistic about saying like women exist and sex matters in some context, you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, this channel
really not fascist.
We deal with cults, a lot of cults and things like that. And I was thinking the other day about, you know, Scientology, they call their enemies suppressive persons. Jehovah's Witness would talk about worldly people, and they all have these different apostates in certain religions as well, these sort of horrible, bad people or whatever. And in the trans debate, it's feminists. And it's, if your enemy, if the sort of the bogeyman of your ideology is feminism, it feels like that you can't be on a progressive side.
Well, I think what progressive means is up for debate, to be honest. But yeah, I think how to put this. I think human beings are very cult-like. It's very easy for human beings to fall into cults of some kind or another. And I think maybe in my darker moments, I think all we can do is pick a good cult. Do you know what I mean?
Or pick many cults.
Some cults are better than others. Yeah, I mean, liberalism is a kind of pluralism in a way. Like you could say it's a plurality of cults or a toleration of different cults, with the aim that they don't interfere with one another too much. You know, the freedom of belief, freedom of expression, up to the point at which you kind of get in someone else's way. I think, though, in the absence of religion, we've ended up with things that have religious qualities but don't understand themselves to be religions. So, you know, if you're on the left and you are sort of expelled for wrongthink, then you're basically a heretic. And, you know, the same kind of puritanical fanaticism we see in some of the kind of, you know, trans ideology, like trans women are women, you know, complete with mantras and, you know, kind of really sort of fixated thought, a lack of flexibility, a lack of ability to have a conversation, to engage in negotiation and dialogue, which is what all mature people have to do with themselves and with others. And politics, in a way, is, I suppose, the art of making people the least unhappy. Do you know what I mean? Like, nobody can get everything they want.
8 billion people in the world.
Right.
It's impossible. Well, look, and it's different because I think what you're saying about it's not acknowledging that it's a religion, I think that's really interesting, because at least when you leave Scientology, if you're excommunicated, it's incredibly painful. Like, it's one of the most painful things that can happen. You can't speak to your family, your friends. You don't know anything about the outside world. Hasidic Judaism, the same thing. You move out, you don't even speak the language. If you're in Brooklyn or something, you've grown up speaking Yiddish. What a difficult thing that is. But at least for Scientology, apart from 30,000 Scientologists, everybody else is like, hey, come in, I'm going to embrace you. Whereas because this sort of leftist gender thing going on doesn't admit that it's a religion, you come out and you're excommunicated and you don't really have anywhere to turn.
Yes, I think that's sort of increasingly the case. And the left I used to be a part of was not like that. It had the idea that, for example, if someone was saying something kind of reactionary or you disagreed with about immigration or whatever, the idea would be to like meet people where they were, right? And that you would discuss things and you would try to give a better explanation. You'd say, oh, actually, it's capital that's pitting you against each other as workers. Do you know what I mean? But you wouldn't shun the person because they said something racist or whatever. Like that, the old left would never do that. The new left or whatever it is definitely does that. It completely ostracizes people who don't share all of the correct beliefs. And in that sense is kind of authoritarian and, you know, unable to engage in dialogue. And then it becomes cult-like, you know, and I think it's actually a death cult, to be honest.
In what sense is it a death cult?
Well, okay, so I mean, you know, we all have a sort of choice to make as to whether we basically celebrate life or we don't. And I think the left is very tied up with guilt. You know, like you started your question with, well, I'm a white man, you know, how should I feel, or how do you feel about me, or something like that. I think if you're a white leftist, especially if you've got a job or something, then the whole thing is you're supposed to feel incredibly guilty for your privilege, you're an oppressor. You know, you've got this kind of binary black and white way of thinking in which you're either on the side of the good or you're bad. You know, it's very borderline personality disorder type way of thinking. You know, everyone is either good or bad. And, you know, like when you look at countries like Canada and you look at their kind of state mandated or state sponsored suicide program, you basically got a state saying, you know, your nihilism can be met in our arms and we'll kill you. You know what I mean? Which is basically eugenics. And I think this kind of liberal culture or part of liberal culture has ended up basically worshipping and celebrating death. You know, it's turned against the family, it's turned against people enjoying themselves, you know.
With population crisis now.
Yeah, people getting along, that's bad. You know, you should be suffering because there's someone in the world who's in a worse state than you. And how dare you, you know, eat an ice cream or something, you fascist.
That was one of the first times where I think I fully realized a few years ago that there are, to almost everything, two sides. And I really like what you're saying about it's just making everybody as not unhappy as they can be and sort of trying to get along. Because I didn't even think about what, I think my liberal instincts, I suppose, used to think, oh, that's a great idea. If you don't want to be on this planet anymore, why should you have to be here, blah, blah, blah. And I didn't think about what that law might do in terms of like pushing people when they're families and maybe they feel like they're a burden on their family and that kind of thing. And that's when you go, oh, okay, everything has another side to it. And that's, I think, been lost. Tell me a little bit about what I get called in the comments quite often. So people are saying you're a beta something, you're a simp, you're this, you're that. What are these words and where are they coming from?
Okay, so as far as I understand some of the alpha beta stuff, I mean, it definitely got picked up in the manosphere, but it was based on a kind of like misreading of chimpanzee analysis. So, and obviously as human beings, from an evolutionary point of view, we're sort of somewhere between chimps and bonobos.
Right.
So I think Franz de Waal talks about this. He used the idea of the alpha and the beta, and you can think about it in terms of chimpanzee politics and other higher apes, where you have sort of forms of domination and territory and so on. I suppose in the human discourse, it's the alpha is supposedly some kind of dominant male, but I mean I talk about this in the book. I mean, it's actually kind of complicated to point to what that would mean in the modern world, because in some sense, the most alpha men are the ones in prison, because they're the ones who are the most violent and not able to contain their violence, if you see what I mean. They're not able to deploy it in a judgmental, positively judgmental way, right? So you could say, well, okay, well, there's some alpha men who are the most violent. They're the strongest men, or they're the most violent men. There are alpha men who are like the richest men, but they don't tend to necessarily be the most physically strong. So actually, when we talk about alpha men, it's not clear at all to whom we refer. We're also kind of governed. We're in the era of the nerd and the kind of computer guy who is not sort of historically the hero, if you see what I mean, that type of person. I guess a simp, as far as I understand it, is a man who will speak to women in a not rude way, potentially.
Right. I should be ruder.
Maybe, I don't know. Well, if you want to impress some sort of,
I do,
some men who think that you should be like blaming women for all the ills of the world or something like that.
It's an appealing proposition. I do find it crazy. I always want to reply because they're saying these things and I think, but you're a really angry person who's a troll, who's anonymous in a comment section, and I'm a guy with a YouTube channel and all these things, and you're on my channel, so surely. But then I think if I reply that, then I've gone down to their level, so I just leave it.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think how to put this. If you're happy in yourself, it doesn't matter what they say. I mean, but this is a tough lesson to learn. I mean, as someone who's been attacked millions of times and millions of people, you sort of get used to it after a while, I suppose. And you're just like, you get
used to it, but don't you always, especially when you feel like you've been mischaracterized, you've got that urge to respond?
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I think we all have to kind of carry on, just say what we think. And I don't know. I mean, yes, maybe with our friends, like to try to give an account of ourselves, but it's basically impossible to give an account of yourself to everyone, and especially to those people who don't actually want you to give a good account of yourself. That's not what they're doing.
Yeah.
It's a form of enjoyment. If you think about everything as a form of enjoyment, even if people are pretending it's not, then, anonymous person sort of being mean about you is them enjoying themselves. Do you know what I mean? It's actually nothing to do with you.
I suppose so, yeah. It's like they know how to get you because they'll do those ones where they really misinterpret what you said. Because if it's just someone saying, you piece of whatever, it's just like, all right, I don't even need to engage with that. But when they're saying, oh, so you think this, do you? And then you're like, oh, I'm going to reply. But just to this one, I'm saying to my fiance, just like, I'll be in bed in a minute and just one more. And it's rude. What am I doing? To people who don't know, what are incels?
Okay, so this is a sort of abbreviated term for involuntary celibate. It's actually coined by a woman to describe a period in her life when she was, not having a sexual relationship with a man. And it sort of got, like the alpha beta thing, got taken up and used in a particular way. I've actually written a defense of incel culture for The Spectator a while back. Insofar as I think it's in a kind of tradition of German Romanticism and Werther and these kind of solitary young men, this kind of this melancholic, kind of poetic type of young men. I think incels has become the name for a group of men that you are allowed to demonize. So they tend to be kind of young working class men. There's a very good documentary by Alex Lee Moyer called TFW No GF, That Feeling When No Girlfriend, when she interviews various young men who are involved in the kind of online, they wouldn't necessarily describe themselves as incels, but they probably would be characterized that way, who use 4chan and make memes. And, this is a few years back. And really what is revealed is that a lot of these young men are basically stranded in towns with no money, like difficult to find a job, that they've found a sense of community actually by, engaging in this kind of humor online. And I think anytime any group is sort of demonized, we have to be very on guard, whether it's feminists, whether it's trans people, whether it's incels, whether it's white men, because this is a tactic to divide us all the time and to make us think that there isn't, shared humanity among us, So when we're talking about difference, like sexual difference, yes, that's real, right? But that doesn't mean that men and women can't get along. In fact, it's one of the reasons we can get along. So where we draw the lines are very, they have to be a matter of public discussion, if you see what I mean. Like which differences are good, if you like, and which differences are imposed and divisive and artificial.
I suppose there are parts of the incel community which are acceptable, and it's I can't find a girlfriend, and they've got gripes, they've got concerns that are we should listen to, and then there are parts that are, like with any community, that are pretty extreme.
Yeah, I mean, I think sometimes there's also a fantasy of an imagined community, like, it's a young man wanting a girlfriend and chatting to other random anonymous men online is not necessarily a member of a community, if you see what I mean. It's somebody who's bored, like we all are sometimes, and is online. And, we're often too quick to put people in groups and say, oh, well, you believe all of these things because you're one of those or something like that. And I think, wanting to have a girlfriend is not an incomprehensible feeling. I mean, most people do want to be loved and admired and respected and understood. I think the complexity comes in when, again, we get this blaming idea, or the idea that, oh, I need to have something, or I deserve something. This is why I actually defend Jordan Peterson in the book, because I say, well, actually what he says is, you can't just demand and deserve these things, right? Actually, the best thing to do in the first place is to look at your own life and take yourself in hand and tidy your room and, get fit and look after yourself so that you're better able to, be with others and look after them. And this is the opposite of that kind of idea that, oh, I deserve X, Y, just because. You know what I mean? Yeah,
I know exactly what you mean. I was about, that was my next question about Jordan Peterson, actually, because he is somebody who is a divisive figure, rightly or wrongly, and a lot of people, I think, haven't really listened to him. I do think, just personally, and I don't want to offend him because I'd love to get him on the podcast at some point, some of his tweets are unnecessary, and they tend to be about politics and things like that. But on psychology, whenever he's spoken, I've just thought, wow. And the way he speaks is brilliant. And I think I showed a friend of mine who's quite wrapped up in a lot of the progressive-y side of things. I spoke to her and she was saying, he's just a bigot, isn't he? Or something like that. And I showed her that clip with Piers Morgan when Jordan Peterson starts crying. He does cry quite often, which I think is nice to show that men can cry. I think that's fine. Just thinking about some of the lonely men, just thinking about lonely men made him that sad that he cried publicly. And I just thought, someone who cares that much shouldn't, as you say, shouldn't be demonized. And he did say exactly what you've just said. He did say, women can choose who they want, and they should choose high. They should have high standards. Why shouldn't they? They should do exactly that. And men should also, try and meet those expectations, do all they can to do that, which I imagine some people would not expect Jordan Peterson to say.
Yeah, sure. And I think, we can all be better. It's not like women are great either, like we're both potentially awful, right? Yeah. We both potentially have awful habits or manners.
You and me, or
men and
women.
Well, you, me.
Yeah. Michal. Yeah, let me tell you about men, Michal, the producer.
Women, do you know what I mean? Like, we're all just here, we all have potentially negative tendencies and habits. So yeah, I mean, I think the more realistic and mature and human thing to do is to recognize that, and to try to work things out sort of together and to be slightly better, which is about all we can manage, apparently. But we can make decisions that are better than others. Do you know what I mean? Like, not everything is the same.
Yeah, no, I think so. And I love this idea of improve yourself, make your bed, you got to get your bed going, make your life good before lecturing others. And because, we can't ignore it. I appreciate we have to show both sides of the incels, and that there is there is a nicer side to it, but there's also a lot of toxicity. I've seen some of what's called shit posting, I suppose, in those incel communities, the way that women are blamed. And it does sometimes go into that sort of victimhood cycle of, oh, well, they're all against me, this kind of thing.
But I think we have to understand also like the role of humor. And I think maybe being slightly older, like, growing up in the 90s, humor was really a fantastic mechanism for mocking everything, including yourself. And, and there's a kind of levity that comes from using humor that avoids some of the kind of darkness. So even if the humor itself is very dark and very mean sounding and potentially offensive, like it's actually better that exists than that people repress it. Very difficult balance to strike. It's and if some people don't have a sense of humor, you can't really tell them to have one because they just don't.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So do you think that it is all that, or is some of it not humor? Does it go beyond that?
Look, I think human beings are going to express a variety of things. Like the internet is just this site of like libidinal free-for-all. If you're an anon and no one's going to track your address, you can write whatever you want. It's like the id is speaking.
Yeah.
We've created this sort of enormous platform for anyone to say anything, whether they mean it or not, right? Sure, there are going to be some horrible things. There are going to be things that sound threatening, and people have posted videos of them killing people, or like that. This is a thing that exists because this is humanity in extremis. Like almost everything is online, almost everyone's online. People do extreme things, men especially. All extremes of behavior really are done by men. That's how it is. The most amazing things and the most awful things.
But surely when it's done in a sort of communal way, we can criticize that and hope to change it.
Yeah, but again, the looseness of some of these communities. I mean, signing up and writing anonymously on a forum doesn't necessarily make you a member of a community, right? And I think these distributed networks, or whatever you want to say, it's like they become objects of study, or objects of derision, or objects of, media attention. But often you're creating an artificial unity where there isn't necessarily one there. You've got like a load of teenagers in different countries writing stupid things on the internet. Do you know what I mean?
That's true. I guess some people link them to some of the extreme sort of acts of, would you call it terrorism? Or
Sure, but that would be like saying, all feminists are like Valerie Solanas,
Who's that?
Oh, she was the woman who shot Andy Warhol.
Oh, wow.
She wrote the Scum Manifesto, which is
That's interesting. That's a whole story I know nothing about.
Okay. Well, yeah, I mean, she's one of the rare women who sort of committed violence, and most likely because Andy Warhol stole her screenplay, or so she claimed, and didn't give it back to her. But, but she wrote the Scum Manifesto, which is a sort of very extreme kind of feminist document in a way, although she wasn't particularly tied to a feminist movement. But it would be like saying, all feminism is violent because this one woman did this violent act. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, I understand that. And with reference to the purity cycle, which I heard you talk about with Chris Williamson, are some progressives causing more harm by just presuming Peterson is bad and evil without engaging with his material?
Well, I think, there's, again, to go back to this black and white borderline, cluster B thing, I think Chris Rufo has been talking about this lately. Like, liberalism has unfortunately and paradoxically, or maybe inevitably, permitted in its pluralism and its toleration the rise and emergence of people with serious psychopathological problems to take over institutions, right? So because people who are sort of even-handed and reasonable and open-minded are going to lose out in certain situations when you have people who are very loud and very kind of authoritarian and very scary, because a lot of people are very afraid and they don't want to lose their job and they don't want to stand up to bullies. But if nobody does, then you have institutions that are dominated by these character types.
Yeah.
And this is where we're at. So the purity spiral, I think, because the left has become a sort of black and white cult in many ways, in which there are good people, in-group good people, and bad out-group people who are heretics, or, and they're people that you're allowed to hate. So if you're a good leftist, hate is bad. So other people hate, but if they hate, you're allowed to hate them. So you have the most pure, wonderful, good reason for hating people because They are the haters. Do you see what I mean?
Yeah.
So you permit yourself this, Aldous Huxley talks about this, this kind of righteous joy in hating the right people. Do you know what I mean? And you can pretend to yourself there's not actually hate because you're not a hateful person. You're a good person.
I suppose like all or almost all hate comes from that. You first convince yourself, you give yourself a bunch of morals. This is where I stand. Those are the bad people. I get to hate them. And it feels like whenever there's been an opportunity in history for that to happen, it has happened. That humans have, if you happen to live in a society and age where black people are perceived as expendable, you will make them into slaves and just treat them as such, and it will feel moral to you to do so. If you live in an age where you consider the Jews to have more money, which is now more power in some ways, despite evidence to the contrary or whatever, and it's subjective, but you consider that to be the case, you can hate them. If you think somebody has gender critical views, right, that's your outgroup, you can hate, which is quite hateful.
Yes, and I think that basically, Freud talks about hate actually coming before love and hate not being the opposite of love, and hate is a necessary feature of our development, because if you think about it, when you're growing up and you're sort of individuating yourself, you have to push others away. So, when young children say, I hate you, mummy, right? In a way, they're also kind of establishing their own identity. So hate is a necessary feature. We don't understand what hate is. We have all this legislation or hate speech, so on, but we don't actually understand what it is. And this is a problem because we actually have to understand that it is kind of a necessary feature of our development. Wow. And even the people we love, we sometimes feel ambivalent towards, right? Like your fiance, my fiance, our friends, we love them. We love our family. We love our friends. But at times we can also feel quite ambivalent towards them. And these feelings are very difficult to integrate, especially in a culture that says, no, you either are a good person or a bad person, because nobody wants to say, oh, look at the darkness inside me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Even though we all have it.
I've definitely noticed relationships, not just my fiance, but friends and family and stuff. There've been moments where if we weren't getting on with one another, we start to see a really different person. And I remember a particular moment when I looked at somebody and I just thought, why did they would never, that's not who they are. Why did they do that horrible thing to me? And I had to really think for a while, like, that's just not them. That's not who that person is. I know that person for years. And it took me realizing it was this cycle that's gone on for years where we've both pushed each other and got meaner and meaner, and the empathy's dried up. And isn't it amazing how conditional that empathy and love and hatred and all that, it's just so conditional. That's scary.
Yeah, it is scary, but I think the mature position or the mature approach is to understand. I mean, this is why religions like Christianity, by the way, have survived so long, because they basically say things like this from the start. We're riven, we're split subjects, we're a combination of good and bad in all of us. We're all capable of doing harm, we're all capable of doing good. Forgive us this day our daily trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. If you see what I mean, lead us not into temptation. We're all prone to addiction, bad behavior. You know what I mean? Like the religions that have survived are the ones that have recognized the reality of human nature in this way.
There is still competitive virtue, though, in Christianity.
No doubt. We're still human. I mean, that's the point. And Christianity says, look, humility is very helpful, because actually you do end up in hubristic, arrogant modes of behavior, including to do with faith. We're always going to be this kind of broken being, if you like, and all we can do is sort of try to be slightly better and make amends, apologize where we've done something wrong, recognize that we've also caused harm. Do you know what I mean?
It's all about how you interpret it, isn't it? Because I think some people will just interpret it and use that, as we were saying before, I think with non-religious ideas, use it as a shield of virtue to do as you please. I'm thinking of Judaism in particular, extreme Hasidic Judaism. They've got something called tznius, which is modesty, wearing long dresses, a wig, a sheitel, I think it's called a sheitel, and all sorts of things like that. And you end up competing with other people for who's got the most modesty, almost the opposite of some of the modern culture, especially, people going out to nightclubs and things like that today, short dresses and things. It's then the long dresses. And I've asked some people who've left that community, and they say, God, it really did it consumed me. And I thought I was just being so virtuous. And I guess that, again, it's the human condition.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, scrupulosity is a form of OCD that has religious components. And I think, if you read René Girard, and when he talks about mimetic rivalry, our desire, to go back to the desire point, comes from seeing what other people desire. So we're basically always in a kind of competition, envy, rivalry with everyone around us, no matter how individuated we think we are and how we think for ourselves and we know what we want and we were interested in this, right? We're massively influenced by everyone around us, like whether we're in a small community or a large global one. Like we constantly try to understand what it is that other people seem to want. If you think about the hipster is no less part of a community. He or she is constantly trying to navigate or negotiate what's cool. The values and so on that attach to communities might be different superficially, but in an anthropological way, they're all the same.
I wonder if some have more substance than others. I'm thinking of like modern art, right? I hope you're not a modern art fan. I know there'll be a lot of modern art fans listening and watching, but I'm convinced that is one place where almost like a multi-level marketing thing where the value is just how much you value something and whoever joins then gets
I mean, to be fair, I'm an art critic, so I do have, no, it's fine. Amongst other things.
Yeah.
No, I think, one of the tricky things that people have when it comes to aesthetics is precisely coming to understand their own feeling about something, right? Because it's very, very difficult, right? The art market, yes, depends a lot upon a kind of almost Ponzi scheme of what is perceived to be desirable. How do you make something worth something? A lot of it is kind of gambling from collectors and so on, right? Which has nothing to do with aesthetic value necessarily, right? But I wouldn't therefore damn all modern art. There isn't such a thing as modern art, if you see what I mean.
Every modern art museum, they always have this. It's almost like the trick, like going out at the end of a roller coaster and you get to see the photo and the souvenirs. Like every one I've been to has got a black square as the art thing. And it's always got people watching it, looking at it going, what the hell? And they're sort of whispering, going, this is nonsense. And I wonder if I guess you could say that's the point. It gets people talking.
Well, I think, you'd have to be really precise about which. But I mean,
the Tate in Cornwall.
Huh?
The Tate Modern in Cornwall.
Yeah.
Black square.
Yeah, Malevich.
Is that right?
Yeah, but the black square is from like 1915, I think.
Is it?
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting actually in the 2020, I was just writing about this, the black square then got resurrected as solidarity with BLM, so actually the black square is a very interesting object.
I suppose so. Yeah. Look, again, I've got to be cynical about things, don't I? I've just, sometimes.
Why do you?
Because hate is an important part of humanity.
I don't know cynicism.
I've just learned that.
But it is, don't you agree?
I walked around feeling hateful in the modern art of all things. Look, if I got to hate something,
that's a reaction. No, but to be sort of true to your own intuitions and your own feelings, right? Rather than seeking to repress them. That's more authentic, right?
Yeah. I must admit they are misguided and ignorant feelings, but they are feelings nonetheless. Would Russell Brand be an alpha male? Is he an example of bad? People use the word toxic masculinity. So I can ask you too: what is toxic masculinity? And is Russell Brand an example of that?
I mean, first of all, I think there is toxic masculinity. If there is, then there's toxic femininity too. I mean, these are just aspects of our sexual difference that are played out in extremis. So women would be stuff like reputational damage, gossip, whatever, like bitchiness. Might be forms of toxic femininity. Russell Brand's an interesting one. I mean, I think people tried to take him down recently, largely because his political views appear to have shifted and he's no longer part of the in-group. So I think a lot of it is a kind of scapegoating, actually. But
that can be true, and he also did a lot of bad stuff.
Yeah, sure. I've no doubt that he was he was self-confessedly a kind of libertine who took advantage, especially at that time. The 90s were very hedonistic. People took a lot of drugs and drank a lot and had a lot of sex, and it was sort of encouraged. Like that was the culture. And this is the thing. It's like everyone's like a fish in water. You can't see the water, like the culture you're in. You just think it's normal. So in the 90s, rightly or wrongly, it was generally encouraged and thought to be cool to behave like this.
Yeah.
And this is before the sort of surveillance culture of the internet and the idea that you could record everything and, people still being recorded. You know what I mean? It was a different moment, even though it's not that long ago. And this is not to say anything judgmental about the behavior or otherwise, but rather just to explain the context. And there were people at the time who were opposed to it as well, not just religious people, but people, maybe thinking this is rather permissive towards men who behave in a caddish way. And I think we have to say that the sexual revolution has largely encouraged the cad as a character type. You know, like, what does it mean to have sex without consequences? That's really what the sexual revolution promised. Who benefits from that? Well, it's not really women and children, is it? It's a certain kind of man who can sort of live without consequences. And I think Russell Brand said explicitly, like, you know, I'm a working class man. I'm going to sort of get my end away as much as I can. Do you know what I mean? Like, I've won the lottery, the sexual lottery. You know, he's sort of charming or whatever. And, you know, lots of women sort of fell for that. He was famous, you know. So I don't know whether he sort of did some terrible things. Maybe he did. But I think, you know, that it was very strange, that sort of 2-week period of like hate, you know, the 2-week hate towards Russell Brand. And he just ignored it. That was quite interesting, wasn't it?
He must be the one person who benefited most from a war between Israel and Hamas. I'm not suggesting Russell Brand started that war, but it's taken the heat off him, just as Russell took the heat off Dan Wootton and Dan Wootton took the heat off Hugh Edwards. You know, that's the news cycle. Good day to bury bad news, or whatever it was after September 11th. And I have sympathy with what you're saying, actually, because I do think we forget instantly that we lived in an entirely different world 10 years ago. I always refer to Ricky Gervais says, you know, no one could have known 10 years ago that today the most offensive thing you could possibly say on Twitter is women don't have penises. So who knows what the next thing in 10 years is going to be. And we do make people as well. So we sort of did make Russell into this libertine, as you say. We did sort of, we clapped and laughed, and I don't think we can now say, oh, we didn't know he was secretly doing that. I think most people did.
I don't think he was secretly doing anything. And I think, you know, for example, people were sort of criticizing him for having sex with a 16-year-old girl, if that was the case. You know, but if you're a 16-year-old girl in the 90s, having sex with Russell Brand would be like, you know, the most amazing thing ever.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, we've got to guide 16-year-olds, don't we? To an extent. We've got to guide 16-year-olds to an extent and say, look, what you think you want now, whether it be having sex with Russell Brand.
Sure, but maybe 16 meant something slightly different in the 90s. I mean, we definitely thought we had sexual agency as teenagers in the night. Do you know what I mean? Like, you, rightly or wrongly, you feel more mature than maybe you are. I mean, it doesn't mean that men should take advantage of it, but you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, well, people have sexual autonomy and the right to have sex at 16, and then be like, oh no, but not like that. You know, either you do or you don't.
That's true. It's true. I still think you can criticize him without him necessarily having broken the law. I feel like 16 is, when you're in your 30s, I think the power imbalance is just too much.
Right, but what I'm saying is that there's a power also in being young and attractive and having sex with an older guy. Do you know what I mean? I haven't done it recently. No, but it's like, you know what I mean? It's you know, I think we're in this very uneasy moment. Maybe we always are, but where we don't quite know where to place power. You know, either some people have it or they don't. We don't really know what it is. You know, I mean, a beautiful young woman has lots of power, right? In some ways, she has the power to attract and seduce and manipulate and crush men's hearts and so on. But at the same time, you know, if we're looking at it purely in terms of, oh, but he's older, he's richer, so on, right? That's a different model of power, right? But both can be true. You know, both exist. Yeah. Actually.
No, I definitely see what you mean. I get that as well. I get that. For me, 16 is just, you know, why isn't it 18? Like most other countries.
I know it's not true that it's most other countries. I think.
Is it not?
I mean, France, it was very young until
7.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, the problem is you hit sort of reality. You know, teenagers do tend to be very horny. And, you know, I kept all my teenage diaries and I wouldn't have thought I was particularly exceptional, but they are extraordinary. Reading them back, just how obsessive they are in terms of like, oh, this boy flirting with this person.
You should publish those next.
God, they're really boring, but surprisingly boring, actually. I was sad. But, you know, what's really revealing is just how that kind of sexual feeling is so dominant. And I think that's, you know, if you think about school, if you go to co-ed schools, the thing is, if we want to stop that, we have to actually do serious make serious changes to our culture as a whole. We basically have to segregate young men and women. We have to put them in single-sex schools. We have to do all the things that people used to do. In fact, we have to have then rituals. You have to have dances in which you bring them together occasionally, or chaperones.
That was my childhood. I went to a single-sex school, and it was fine for me. Maybe that's why I have old-fashioned ideas or something about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even saying they're bad. I mean, I think, to be honest, probably young men and women would get a lot more done if they were kept apart. I actually don't necessarily think it's a good idea to have teenagers.
When I had acne and stuff, I was like, I went into school breathing a huge sigh of relief. I think the whole school did a collective sigh of relief that no woman had to see, like when you had all pimply things around.
Right.
Oh,
and I think the same for girls. It's like, single-sex female schools do a lot better because, less distraction. So again, like this mixed world, we've created this like deeply mixed world, but maybe it's too mixed. Maybe we need to pull back a bit, spend more time with the same sex, and then we'd also have more like enchantment of the other sex. We wouldn't be so proximate. We wouldn't be so over familiar. Like I've tried to write in various places about how we're more like siblings, like men and women have become like brother and sister.
Right.
And this isn't good.
Yeah. I just interviewed someone from a cult where brother and sister did do that.
Yeah.
Yeah, not good results, unfortunately.
Well, no, you see, they're sort of too proximate.
Yeah, and the DNA doesn't work.
No,
so led to a lot of infertility in the.
Yeah. No, I mean that's grim, and I think the incest taboo is like one of the oldest taboos, and if not the oldest, actually, for a good reason. Like social and biological reasons why the incest taboo is a good thing.
Yeah. What do you think there are examples of toxic femininity?
Yeah, I mean, I said gossip and reputational damage, and I think, women maybe. I think sometimes this question of power. I think sometimes there's a way women don't want to acknowledge that they do have power, and that this is actually a form of power to deny that you have it,
especially to these days.
Yeah, so the victim mentality. I mean, we could talk about. The kind of the longhouse, the feminization of institutions. Like a lot of people have suggested that bureaucracies have become very female, and that these kind of typically feminine qualities like concern and care and safety are actually creating huge problems in institutions.
Are they biological? I just wonder.
Yeah.
My fiance, if I put like a bag on the bed, she's like, that bag's been on the floor outside, and like all that, and that's like such a stereotype. And I sit there going, God, we are such a stereotype. Why are we a stereotype?
I think there's a lot of social, cultural, personal difference between different men and women, right? So there's a wide range of behaviors. But look, we're biologically different, like profoundly on every level, like in a cellular way, in a cosmic way, in physical, and so that is obviously going to have effects on our psychology and our social behavior. So yes, I mean, I think women are less strong than men, so they're not going to use physical violence to solve their problems, which is hence the linguistic reputational damage. That's how you get rid of your rivals. Or you screw people over, or you say stuff about men, or you try and destroy people's character because you're not going to have a fist fight with them. You know what I mean? I
suppose some women do engage in that sort of physical dominance, and some men have that feminine toxicity.
Sure. So I'm saying there's like a wide range. Like we all know people who don't conform to stereotypes, like I say I'm quite masculine in lots of ways in the way I try and problem solve and so on. I'm not very emotional, but there are men who are very emotional. And, do you know what I mean? So of course there's like dynamic range.
Maybe you can answer me this, because I go to the gym now. I don't really. I go and play tennis because I feel like I'm not a very manly man. And when I see the men in the gym and in the changing rooms, I feel like I'm a different species. And it's because they do all the snorting in the shower. I don't even want to make the noises, obviously, on a podcast, but the noises. And I'm just like, I just want to enjoy a nice shampoo of my hair and relax. And I actually make a noise because they do that. And it's all the time that, like, what are they doing? And I actually go, oh, like that. But then it just sounds like I'm doing something else in the shower. But, I'm like, like to show I'm disgusted by these people. And then they continue doing it. And so what are they doing?
I don't know if I can answer precisely, but maybe you could say it's sort of territorial or like sonic dominance. Or
like they can't do this at home. Like whatever this,
Well,
like they seem to be putting phlegm up from their throat into their nose and then expelling it.
I read a brilliant definition of masculinity by Matt Chrisman, where he said that masculinity or being a man is like the abstract rage to protect.
The abstract
rage to protect.
What does that mean?
So I suppose it's like combination of constantly sort of being on the lookout for danger and wanting to care, but also being angry, and like I don't know, this kind of, he put it in this very poetic way, and it just seemed like a very profound insight, really, like this kind of combination. And I often hear men speaking about this, like, going to a room and you're kind of working out the danger, you're working out your relative strengths compared to other men, and even not so to dominate, but just to sort of get an understanding of where strength is or power is. And I think the ancient Greeks, when they talked about masculinity, it was actually about deploying judgment. It's like knowing when to use your strength or knowing when to intervene. It's not just being randomly violent or whatever, right? To go back to the alpha male thing, it's actually having this discernment and judgment, and also because then you're able to sort of protect others, right? Mm-hmm. Like if you're walking with your mother, or your girlfriend, or someone who's physically, or your children, physically weaker than you are. And it's not always about physical strength. It's also about avoiding confrontation.
Yeah.
So precisely, like almost all the time we want to avoid physical confrontation. So It would be about diplomacy. It would be about backing down. Potentially it would be about knowing. It's a sort of like a learning how to deal with different situations.
I think my masculine strength is a surprising daintiness. I've got these, look at my little hands. See how small they are? I'm 6'3". I've got these little hands.
Like Trump.
Yeah, I got the little Trump hands, but I'm daintier. He's not very dainty. He's got small hands, but he's not dainty. I like being dainty, and I hate all the snorting noises. It drives me mad. So that's my thing, I suppose. And it's like my dominance is me. Hey, I'm trying to be dainty over here, and you're in the shower of the gym snorting. But tell us where to get your book, and where do you want to send people who are watching?
Well, I think my book is mostly available in bookshops, although some mad people try and cancel it and hide it and not stock it. But, usual places. The paperback has been out for a few months by Penguin. I don't think it's very much money on Amazon. And I read the audiobook, so you can hear me laughing my way through my own words, which is delightful, my squeaky voice.
Lovely voice.
It's a terrible voice. And I have a Substack, but I mostly just write weird poems on there. But really, the main thing is that I'm one of the editors for Compact magazine, which is fantastic and people should read it. And it's very heterodox, kind of contemporary political cultural magazine.
Wait a second, there's more. Hit the like button on Nina Power's video and share it with friends on socials. Then let's delve further into the issues with how the media treat men, comedy, and reality with one half of the Trigonometry podcast, Francis Foster.